Of the 471 deaths caused by the construction accidents that we're going to look at today in this video, only 13 were unavoidable. For the other 458 unlucky souls, we'll see how greed and negligence cost the companies money, but cost the victims everything. My name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we talk about all sorts of topics as long as they are at least a little bit dark. So let's get morbid. Our first construction accident happened in the South Korean city of Incheon. As a rapidly growing urban area, as you can imagine, there is a lot of construction going on at any given time. Unfortunately, South Korea has gained a poor reputation for safety when it comes to construction sites. It was a nice spring day, and 78 construction workers were busy working on a 107,000 square foot building that was going to be a cold storage warehouse. The workers were on teams for 9 different subcontractors. That day, almost everyone was either on the lower of the 2 basement floors or on the second of the 4 floors above the ground. Some were working on laying floor tiles, some on installing cargo elevators, and some were spraying polyurethane foam on the walls for insulation. The lower of the basement floors, also known as a sub-basement, that day had a thickness in the air caused by the use of solvents needed for the polyurethane insulation. Then, suddenly, and without any warning, at about 1:30 in the afternoon, an explosion set the basement ablaze. A witness who was later interviewed said, quote, "I first saw black smoke billowing out of the building, followed by 8 or 9 explosions and flames. It spread so fast that in less than 2 minutes, the building was engulfed in smoke and fire." It isn't actually known what started the fire, but the solvents and the polyurethane definitely fueled it. Polyurethane had been chosen for the project, not only because it's cheap, but it's still a good insulator. Unfortunately, it is highly flammable, and when it's on fire, it releases toxic gases, which can incapacitate a person with just one breath. The situation was made worse by the fact that the building was still under construction, so the sprinklers hadn't been installed yet. Of the 78 people who were in the building, only half of them made it out alive. People who made it out said that the smoke was so black that they were barely able to find their way out. It was 5 hours or so before they were able to finally extinguish the fire. When authorities were finally able to get in the building, they found 18 bodies in the sub-basement where the fire began, and they found most of the rest of the people on the second floor. Some of the bodies were so badly burned that identification had to be done through DNA testing. Blood taken during the autopsies revealed that at least 23 of the victims actually died from carbon monoxide poisoning from the toxic fumes. It is believed that the workers were under pressure to speed up construction, which led them to welding and working with flammable materials at the same time. As we have talked in other videos, corporate greed kills. All of the construction workers at the site were freelance or the subcontractor's employees, so none of them would have felt that they would have been able to complain about the environment not being safe without putting their jobs at risk. These people were having to choose between their safety and being able to support themselves and their families. Absolutely disgusting and incredibly sad. I wish I could say that some change came out of this tragedy, but it really isn't enough. Following the disaster, new laws were revised which limited the use of polystyrene and polyurethane during building construction. Unfortunately, the laws are not retroactive, so any building built before 2015 may still have these hazardous materials, leaving those buildings at risk for further tragedy. You are going to see that each of these tragedies usually comes down to negligence. This one is no different. For this one, we go to Korba, India, where construction on a power plant was well underway. Officially, the construction company hired for the project was one based out of China. However, they decided to hand over construction of the chimneys to a more local construction company, which was based out of Mumbai. On September 23, 2009, Korba was hit by a very strong thunderstorm, along with torrential rain. Rain is one thing, but torrential rain can be very dangerous, causing flooding and possibly sweeping people away. So, the workers on the site that day took off running into the storeroom of the chimney that they were working on. It would be around 820 feet tall when it was done, but at the time, it was still a towering 787 feet tall. Some say that it was the rain, some say that it was a lightning strike. But whatever happened, the chimney came crashing down with all those people inside. The rubble from the structure covered an area equivalent to just under 3 football fields. Hundreds of people rushed to the site, and over 20 earth-moving machines like cranes and excavators were brought in to attempt to rescue those trapped. Unfortunately, the rescue was slowed down by the torrential rain, and when they finally pulled out the last body, 41 people were dead. I need to mention that only 40 of those people were found inside the rubble. One body was found outside the chimney, and at first it was thought that the person who had worked for the construction company had died after falling off the chimney when it collapsed. But on closer inspection, it was obvious that this person actually had been attacked. Although no one was held responsible and no one would admit it, it is believed that he was killed immediately after the collapse by angry workers. Investigations into the disaster showed negligence, if you can believe it. Turns out that the ground underneath the chimney was not strong or stable enough to support the immense structure. They found that the materials used in the building were not a good enough quality, not to mention that the design was faulty. And, on top of it all, the concrete hadn't been properly cured, which meant that the structure was not as strong as it should have been. I am happy to say that there was at least some justice. Several people, the project manager, 3 officials from the power plant, and 3 officials from the Chinese construction company, were arrested and charged with culpable homicide and conspiracy. Our next tragedy happened at Willow Island in West Virginia. There had been a power plant at the site already, but it was being built better and larger than ever, with 2 new generators and 2 new cooling towers. On September 27, 1978, they were in the process of building the second cooling tower. Layer by layer, they would pour the concrete into the form. The scaffolding was attached to the previous poured layer, and a rig allowed for enormous buckets of concrete to be lifted up to the top and poured in for the next layer. It was just after 10 a.m. when the second bucket of concrete for the day was being lifted. Just then, people heard cracking coming from the area that they were working in. But, not knowing, or perhaps not wanting to believe what they were hearing, they kept working. As they moved on to the third bucket, it happened. The previous layer of concrete, the one that the scaffolding was attached to, suddenly gave way. The scaffolding, the layer of concrete that they just poured, the previous layer of concrete, the rig, the bucket, and all of the workers up on the scaffolding, inside and outside of it, fell. As everything fell, it caused a crane to fall into the walls, causing all the rest of the layers to fall like dominoes all the way around, first one direction and then in both directions. This all occurred 170 feet above the ground. I cannot imagine the terror. When it all became quiet, 51 people were dead. An article published that day after the incident reported that the construction workers at the site had complained about the speed at which they were doing the construction. They felt as if they were pushing the work, and they knew that the concrete wasn't fully set and cured before they began putting loads on it. They knew what they were doing wasn't safe. As with every construction accident, OSHA arrived and the investigation began. And oh boy, what they found was a real shit show. Are you ready for this? The investigation found that the construction workers from the paper were telling the truth. The concrete had not only not cured completely, but the concrete hadn't undergone any of the required testing that would have shown that the proportions of the concrete were off. So the concrete itself wasn't as strong as it should have been. They found that the cranes were in appropriate positions so that they would be able to hoist up more concrete faster. Then, oh my God, the scaffolding. You have got to be kidding me. The anchors that were used to attach the scaffolding were not only the wrong grade, but some of them were missing altogether. And then, I seriously cannot make this up. The scaffolding itself had been in need of repairs since it was being used in the construction of the previous cooling tower. Now that should be infuriating enough, but then get this. OSHA had done 13 inspections over the 5 years before the collapse and had found, and I quote, numerous violations, both serious and non-serious. Yet, a spokesperson for the company claimed that the most recent inspection, which had happened the year before, hadn't included an inspection of their construction operations. Then, when questioned about safety nets, he replied that one had been on the outside of the tower and it hadn't worked because it was sucked in during the collapse. But when asked about a safety net on the inside of the tower, he refused to say whether or not there was one. He did, however, say that safety regulations required them inside and outside. Although, if there was no safety net inside, they should be held accountable. But, from what I know about the incident, I highly doubt even if there had been a net on the inside that it would have helped much, if any at all. Then, the freaking gall of this next guy. The director of corporate communications for the construction company said it was a complete mystery on how it could happen. The last thing I want to mention about this tragedy is that tragically and ironically, outside the building where the representatives talked to the reporters about the tragedy, there was a billboard promoting plant safety. A construction worker dryly remarked, "They'll have to take that down." This tragedy is the most mysterious since there is so much we don't know about it. We don't know exactly how many victims there were, who they were, and we don't know what caused it. But here is what we do know. The tragedy, known as the Chicago Crib Fire, took place on January 20th, 1909. A water crib is a water collection and storage structure that allows water to be collected and carried to towns or cities. The one we are talking about today was 2 miles off the shore of the south side of Chicago. The area was growing so fast that they needed more fresh water, so they needed to build another crib. At the time, the workers on the project were in the process of constructing the tunnel between the crib and the shore, which was 160 feet below and under the riverbed. It was early morning before the workday had begun for those living in the wooden barracks. Suddenly, there was a call made to the office on shore from someone yelling for them to send help immediately because there was a fire. But then, just as abruptly, it ended, mid-sentence. The fire appeared and spread so fast that some people never even got out of their bunks. And for those who managed to make it out of the barracks onto the pier, were still not out of danger. The pier itself was also wooden, so it wasn't long before it too was ablaze. The workers, desperate to live, jumped into the lake in spite of it being winter. Those that could climbed or clung onto ice floes. The tugboat was steam operated and had to wait for steam to build up before it was able to move, and the smaller boats with them weren't able to navigate the ice on the lake. It was nearly an hour before help finally arrived, but by then, dozens had already died. It isn't known exactly how many died in the fire versus how many died in the lake from drowning or freezing to death. Out of the over 100 people believed to have been there, only 48 survived. Since the crib fire happened so far offshore, the press wasn't able to be there to document the fire, and because most of the workers were immigrants, there really wasn't any interest in hearing their stories of what happened. So there isn't a lot of documentation of the incident, in spite of the death toll. Not to mention that the city authorities didn't want to investigate. If the people found out how dangerous the conditions had been for those men, they would have been forced to shut down the construction. The good people at City Hall certainly didn't want that. In spite of all of that, we know that the barracks were only designed to accommodate 90 people at a time, and there was a list of people who had been working. However, it only had 79 names on it, yet they were able to recover 47 bodies, and 48 people were rescued, not to mention anyone else whose body wasn't able to be recovered. Oh, and it was a Titanic situation, before the Titanic was a thing. Now, we already know that there was a minimum of 95 people there. Yet, there were only a dozen or so life jackets, not to mention there were no boats or life rafts. There are theories of causes, but nothing can be proved. About 3 minutes before the flames appeared, there was an explosion, but what caused it? Whether it was a stove, a cigarette, or gasoline that had been used as pest control for bedbugs, all that remains from the tragedy is a plaque that says, "In memory of crib fire, 45 unknown men, January 20th, 1909. This next tragedy is going to sound a lot like the one we've already discussed, but with this one, there were even more fatalities. November 24th, 2016, in Fengcheng, China, there were over 100 construction workers on the site of a power station where they were building a new cooling tower. That day, there were 68 construction workers up on the scaffolding, again anchored to the walls that had been previously poured, and there were dozens more workers on the ground. Suddenly, without warning, the scaffolding and the crane and all the workers in the air plummeted towards the ground. The rubble covered over 3 square miles of area, and 277 firefighters, 43 fire trucks, and 10 rescue dogs were brought in a feeble attempt to rescue those people trapped in the wreckage. Sadly, they were only able to recover 2 people alive, and they found 74 bodies. I wish I could tell you that it was just an accident and that there was no way that it could have been prevented, but that's simply not true. In fact, the construction company had had similar accidents in the past, and they didn't have a good record for quality work or safety. Just earlier that month, a newspaper reported that project managers had been given a warning for 4 safety violations, 2 of which were not using scaffolding rails that were up to standard and allowing workers to work without safety harnesses. Then it came out that 2 months before the accident, on September 13th, 2016, there was a meeting to discuss possibly speeding up the construction of the project. The new change in the timeline of the build had even been given a name, the 100-day dash. In response to the meeting, the wooden scaffolding that helped stabilize the poured concrete until it had completely dried was removed. Without the framework, the concrete wasn't able to support itself, and it's what caused the collapse. Thankfully, there was at least some justice. 9 people, including the chairman and the chief engineer for the power plant, were arrested for their part in what led to the disaster. This next entry is a set. Although they occurred 9 years apart, they are forever linked because they both occurred on the Quebec Bridge. The first thing that shocked me about this situation was that the chief engineer for the Quebec Bridge Company had never worked on a bridge that was longer than 300 feet. Mind you, the St. Lawrence River at its narrowest point is 2 miles wide. So they did decide to hire a consultant for the project. Only, it would have been nice if they had actually listened to him. They decided on a cantilever bridge, and the original design was revised so that the bridge supports would be closer to the shore. This meant that the water wouldn't be as deep, so construction would be easier, and it would allow it to be completed a year earlier. So, construction on the bridge began in 1904, and by summer of 1907, it was almost halfway done. Everything seemed to have been going according to plan until June 15th. An inspection was performed on the bridge, and it was discovered that 2 of the girders were out of alignment by a 1/4 inch. Work continued. On August 6th, workers began noticing that some of the lower support beams were bending, and they made their concerns known. The consulting engineer reached out to the manufacturer of the steel beams and was told that the beams had been bent when they left the factory. Pause. What? Oh, hell no. You are telling me that the company sent them warped beams? That sounds like the manufacturer doesn't give a crap about the quality of their product. But you know what pisses me off even more about it? You're telling me that during the 3 years that they were working on that bridge, no one, not a single person, noticed before that they had been sent beams that were bent? Absolutely not. The chief engineer on the project bought the excuse, and construction continued. Then, on August 28th, the girders that were once a 1/4 inch out of alignment and were 3/4 of an inch out of alignment just days prior was inspected again, and this time they were 2 1/4 inches out of alignment. In just days, they had moved a freaking 1.5 inches. The inspector was extremely concerned, as you could imagine, and since his concerns had been brushed aside before, he decided he had no choice but to go to New York City himself to talk to the consultant. Before he left for New York, he told the chief engineer to stop all construction until he got back. But as soon as he left, construction started up again. The next day, the men working on the bridge were unsettled, and some even debated whether they should even go to work at all. At that same time, the inspector was meeting with the consultant and told him everything that he'd observed. After seeing how serious the inspector was, the consultant sent an urgent telegram to the construction office back in Quebec, telling them to stop the construction immediately and evacuate the bridge until further notice. The chief engineer was the one in the office that day, so he was the one who received the telegram. He refused to believe that there was anything wrong with the structure and that the beams had, in fact, been bent when they received them. So he didn't forward the message to the men on the bridge. How damn wrong he was. The men who worked that day were relieved and reassured when the whistle blew at 5:30 p.m., announcing that the workday was over and that it was time for them to put their tools away. Then, at 5:37 p.m., with all the men still cleaning up for the day, it happened. The sound of the bridge collapsing was heard over 25 miles away as 70 million tons of steel fell into the river 300 feet below. Horrifically, not all of the people died immediately. Many were trapped under the beams in shallow water. And the river would rise and fall throughout the day. Since the sound had been heard so far away, many of the workers' families heard the commotion and rushed to the bridge site. It was completely gut-wrenching as some of those people arrived to see their friends, their sons, their husbands slowly die as the water rose up and over them. Many of the people who died that day were never recovered. It was also terribly tragic because many of those who died were steelworkers from the nearby Mohawk Reserve. Their small community lost so many. Those men didn't have to die, not only because of the chief engineer's negligence, but also because the whole thing could have been avoided by simply adding reinforcement beams. But don't forget, I said this tragedy had a second part. 5 years after the bridge collapse in 1912, construction on the second bridge would start again, in the same exact spot as the first bridge. Learning from the last disaster, they decided to go back to the drawing board. They redesigned it and got to work on its construction. For years, everything went according to plan, and 3 years after construction began, they were almost done. They had built a cantilever on each side of the river, and all that was left was to hoist the middle part of the bridge into place. The middle section weighed over 5,000 tons, and they were using hydraulic machines to raise the middle part up 2 feet at a time. After being lifted up several times, one of the forecastings broke, causing that corner of the bridge to fall, pulling on the other 3, each of which gave way, killing 13. This time, there was no one to blame. It was a freak accident. But the bridge had to be built to support the nearby populations, so construction began again the following summer. The bridge was finally completed in mid-September of 1917. Now, we have arrived at the final entry for this video. It had been a very stormy September so far in Mecca. It wasn't surprising because half of all thunderstorms in Saudi Arabia occur in the fall. Because of this, and knowing that there was going to be an influx of people at the Grand Mosque, the governor of Mecca ordered that all construction machines to be moved back. With the yearly pilgrimage, the Hajj, only a week away, safety was at the top of his list of concerns. The mosque had been expanded on over the years, but construction over the last decade had been bigger than ever to accommodate the ever-growing numbers of people, and it would almost double the area for praying. Most importantly, the extra space was to make the mosque safer, since it had a history of stampedes. For some reason, though, the order to move the crane owned by the Bin Laden group wasn't followed, and the crane had been left in its place, with the crane extended at a high angle. And yes, you did hear that right, Bin Laden, as in Osama bin Laden. Long before his father disowned him for his religious extremism, his father, Muhammad bin Laden, founded the Bin Laden group, which is now a billion-dollar company. Anyway, the 600-foot-long boom was left straight up, as the picture shows the position of the crane during the storm. Even light winds can be very dangerous, as the boom and the cords and laces act like a sail. If the wind had been blowing the other way, experts believe that the accident never would have happened, and even more negligently, the crane was completely unattended, so even if someone had noticed that the wind was causing dangerous movement in the crane, there was no one there who could have stopped it. At the time of the accident, the wind was between 50 and 65 miles an hour. The boom, which is the long arm, and the jib, which is the short arm, were both pushed by the wind back over the crane, which caused it to lose its center balance, causing the whole thing to come crashing down over the roof of the mosque. Initially, 87 people were believed to have been killed, and a few hundred were injured. By the next day, that number of fatalities rose to 107. 2 days later, after the collapse, the final death toll would end with 111, with many who initially survived dying from their injuries. And 394 people were injured. I cannot imagine how many more people would have died if it had been just a week later during the pilgrimage. For reference, last year during the week of the Hajj, almost 1 million people were there. It was already tragic, but could you imagine? And that's it for today. If you like dark topics and want to see more, hit the subscribe button. I'm working towards reaching 500 subscribers, and I'd like to thank everyone who has subscribed so far. Don't forget to check out the community page on Wednesdays to vote on the next week's topic, which drops on Fridays. Be merry, but stay morbid.